Welcome back, all of you. We can start. We start with Sean Anthony, who is a professor of Near Eastern languages and cultures at the Ohio State University. His scholarship focuses on early Islamic history and the emergence of the literary traditions and canons of Arabic literature. Among his publications are Muhammad and the Empires of Faith, The Making of the Prophets of Islam, and Crucifixion and Death as Spectacle, Umayyad Crucifixion in the Late Antique Context. He is also the editor and translator of The Expeditions, an early biography of Muhammad by Ma'mar ibn Rashid. He will now speak to us about post-Quranic prophetology in Arabic inscriptions from the Marwanid period. Please, Anthony.
Thank you. We're ready to go. Thank you very much, Ella, and thank you for the invitation to come here. So I wanted to share with you 10 inscriptions that I find interesting. I can't take the credit for discovering any one of them, but collecting these sorts of things is something I've been doing a lot recently, and I think they provide a lot of important insight that perhaps has not been fully taken into account by historians of the early Islamic period. And so we're going to be going through some examples of those. But first I'll start with my kind of introduction, my case for the importance of epigraphy. Early Arabo-Islamic epigraphy is, in my mind, of central importance to any effort to chart the history of the emergence, dissemination, and evolution of early Muslim religiosity from the 7th to 8th centuries, and of course beyond, if you're not so interested in the early period. This corpus, the corpus of documented inscriptions from this period is regionally diverse, relatively regionally diverse. It's relatively large. Inscriptions from the first 2 Islamic centuries number in the thousands at least. We don't really know how many yet because we're not done. The new discoveries are also expanding its scope, especially in recent decades. And one finds that a single inscription viewed in isolation rarely reveals much to us. Most of the inscriptions, though certainly not all, tend toward the very formulaic. They only mention a name, a couple of pious phrases. Yet, when we look at them in the aggregate and examine their patterns, they tend to show us not minor things, but rather massive societal transformations. In particular, the groundswell in the epigraphic habit of Arabic speakers who lived during these centuries, they kind of bear witness to the transformation of their own religiosity, and also the ways in which their time period markedly differed from that of the pre-Islamic period. The earliest strata of Arabo-Islamic inscriptions shed light on a host of fundamental historical questions about the evolution of the Arabic language and its script, and the development of Muslim religiosity and the dissemination of its expression, the codification and the reception of the Qur'an and its idiom, and how a burgeoning Islamic polity projected the icons of its imperial dominion into public space, as well into the hearts, as well as into hearts and minds through the medium of the Arabic language. These early inscriptions also survive in sundry forms. Some are monumental, that is, they're official inscriptions that adorn milestones and the edifices of constructions commissioned by Umayyad governors, Umayyad caliphs, and their other officials. Others are epitaphs. They're written to commemorate and honor the dead or to mark their grave sites, but the vast majority seem to be non-monumental lapidary inscriptions. Graffiti is like it sounds bad nowadays, but it's just, things written by regular people. Graffiti that were inscribed in the rock by persons whose names and existence would often otherwise be lost to time. The earliest inscriptions have an especially important role to play in how modern historians conceptualize the earliest history of the Qur'an, I believe, the primeval document of Islamic religiosity, in my estimation, as well as its reception among Arabic speakers in the 7th and 8th centuries. The full scope of the role the inscriptions will play alongside other sources such as Arabic papyri and early mushafs, etc., and our understanding of the scripture's textual history is yet to be determined. All the same, what is particularly striking to me at least is that so many of these early Arabo-Islamic inscriptions, especially compared to their pre-Islamic predecessors, are so thoroughly suffused with the idiom of the Quran. These inscriptions are not merely in Arabic, they are in Arabic of a particular sort. And they give expression to a particular religiosity that bears discrete markers of Muslim identity. They often differ markedly from pre-Islamic inscriptions, not merely in their paleographic and linguistic features, but also in their content as well. This isn't always the case, but it's pretty common. Occasionally, such early inscriptions cite verses from the Quran directly, or at least versions thereof. Direct citations of the Quranic text occur frequently enough that the epigraphic habit of the first generation of Muslims may even have deposited for us a sort of Quran of the rocks, to borrow Frédéric Imbert's useful phrase. The texts of these inscriptions are thus, to my mind, an indelible testament to the early reception and the dissemination of the Quran as well, and the distinctive Arabic idiom of its religiosity. Yet, and this is, I'm not really talking about the Quran here, yet as early Islamic inscriptions reveal, Muslim religiosity did not remain ossified within or simply constrained by the idiom of the Quran either. As Robert Hoyland has already convincingly shown, many of the stock pious phrases found in early epigraphy, despite the innovations they contain, also have clear precursors and pre-Islamic inscriptions, whether they be Sabbaic or whether they be in Greek, still in the region. But in this essay, my principal aim is not to further document a Quran of the rocks, but rather survey a handful of examples of post-Quranic themes that appear in what seems to be the earliest stratum of Arabo-Islamic inscriptions that survive, mostly from the Marwanid period. Some of them might be earlier, but there's no way of knowing unless they actually bear a date. My basic criteria for which inscriptions I include, because not all of them are dated, some of them are explicitly dated, but I have two paleographical criteria that I'll kind of mention and demonstrate as I go forward, and that will do with a medial eye and a retroflex, yeah. In any case, the two themes that I want to focus on that are non-Quranic themes that are found in these early inscriptions are, number one, prayers for the intercession as shafa'ah of the Prophet on behalf of his nation on the day of judgment or the day of resurrection, and two, prayers to be led to or granted passage to an eschatological pool called al-Hawd in Arabic of the Prophet Muhammad. This is the Hawd which all the believers will be gathered around at the end of days. And Roberto Totoli has a really great article that actually he presented the last time I was here, and it's now finally published. I recommend reading that. It's a really great article. The first of these two themes, the eschatological intercession of Muhammad on behalf of his nation, appears in the most studied and famous inscription of the Marwanid period, the monumental inscriptions commissioned by the Caliph Abd al-Malik for the Dome of the Rock in Jerusalem here. But most of these early epigraphic testimonies to these themes appear in non-official inscriptions, such as the graffiti and or epitaphs of early Muslims, and they're by people whose identities are more or less unknown, or they left no mark on any literary or historical chronicle, or identification with potential candidates from these historical chronicles is conjectural and not for certain in any way. So what I'm going to go through is give you kind of selections of each of those as we kind of go through them. Before I head on to this topic, I want to say a word about the idea of shafa'ah as it appears in the Quran, because it's important to know what the Quran says about it in order to get an idea of how these inscriptions differ from the Quranic corpus in terms of their kind of ideological orientation to the very idea of eschatological intercession. So the idea of eschatological intercession is not alien to the Quran at all. The word shafa'ah and its verbal and nominal derivatives appear quite often in the Quran, over 30 times at least. Yet the Quran does display, as Eva Riyad noted in a really good and older study, a very hesitant attitude towards the idea of the shafa'ah. Whether humankind or any individual may hope for intercession with God on their behalf from holy, righteous, or angelic persons on the day of judgment is by no means assured in the Quranic corpus. Indeed, some passages appear to deny the possibility of any such hope whatsoever. Riyad, in her kind of older study, isolates three central themes associated with shafa'ah and more or less rely upon her. And they are warnings against the day of judgment and the fate of the damned, which will have no shafa'ah. Polemics against false deities and pagan hopes vain hopes in their intercessory powers. Not going to be shafa'ah for them either. That's 1 and 2. And thirdly, lastly, hymns extolling the glory and sovereignty of God as sole judge. To have an intercessor on your behalf sort of is seen deleterious to his role as the ultimate sovereign judge. Okay, altogether absent, despite the appearance of the idea of shafa'ah in the Quran, is any explicit mention of the theme of the eschatological intercession of the Prophet Muhammad on behalf of his ummah. It's totally gone, not there. So, indeed, not only that, we could say the Quran contains no shortage of polemics against the idea of shafa'ah or eschatological intercession. Many of the most categorical statements against intercession are not directed towards the followers of Muhammad, but rather against the disbeliever, the recalcitrant, the damned. For instance, Al-Mudathir, the 48th verse, says of the says of the hopeless lot of the inhabitants of Saqar that no intercession or intercessors will benefit them. فَمَا تَنْفَعُهُمْ شَفَاعَةُ الشَّافِعِينَ. Right? And likewise, Ash-Shu'ara portrays the inhabitants of hell as declaring, فَمَا لَنَا مِنْ شَفِيعٍ. So now we have no one to intercede for us, nor a devoted friend. If only we had a chance to return or join the believers. Actually, this word wali that you talked about appears a lot in these passages as well, which is interesting. Anyway, we can go on and on. What the main key theme is that not only disbelievers receive such warnings, other verses addressed to humanity generally declare that no one really has intercession before God, even if they're just believers themselves. And the thing is, while anti-intercession verses usually address individuals and groups contend to disbelieve, some of them do directly seem to address believers as well. So in Baqarah, in the 254th verse, we have, for example, this declaration, Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu, O you who believe, spend of what we provided you before there arrives a day in which there shall be no bargaining, no friendship, no shafa'ah. And then An'am, same idea. When those who fear to be gathered before the Lord, warn those who fear to be gathered before their Lord. Besides him, they have no protector, no intercessor. These verses exemplify what Nicolai Sinai has called the radical eschatological individualism of the Quran. One must essentially face God and his judgment alone with naught but one's deeds. One thing I think is general about a general observation about the Quran's rhetorical style, and I'll go over this relatively quickly, is usually whenever you do find categorical statements to one effect or the other, a lot of times you have these lightning phrases that sort of pull back the categorical, straightforward nature of the claim. And so you get this also with shafa'ah as well. The idea is mostly that with shafa'ah doesn't occur, but you have exceptions except by God's permission. And so you have some instances where you have hints in verses where you have a very straightforward declarative statement that God will not allow any intercessor on the day of judgment, and that'll be followed with a clarifying statement or a qualifying statement, something like illa bi'idnihi, right? Only except by his permission. And it's a question, and it's a reasonable point to be made whether or not this leaves kind of the back door open for some other kind of future ideas of intercession. Anyway. And so I guess some of the examples that we can cite, there are many instances in the Quran where Muhammad, for example, asks for forgiveness on behalf of somebody. Does a prayer forgiveness on behalf of believers later on, particularly Medinan passages. And the distinction that usually is made between these sorts of passages and the kind of eschatological claims are that there's a big difference between praying for someone's forgiveness while one is alive and basically interceding with God at that penultimate moment in one's existence where you face either eternal inferno or eternal felicity in paradise, right? Any case, overall, as I said before, the Quran's attitude towards the efficaciousness and permissibility of the eschatological intercession is hesitant, it's ambiguous. All the same, that such ambiguous posture does not survive long in early Muslim eschatological discourse. In early Islamic piety and religiosity, Muhammad quickly becomes a major figure of eschatological importance for his followers on the Day of Judgment, and the traditions on his intercessory role as their prophet are both early and abundant. So you find it all over the Hadith literature, just in short, even if they leave no small amount of theological controversy in their wake. I think a lot of the earliest objections tend to be mostly among the Mu'tazila, even though it's a pretty famous Salafi objection nowadays. Early Arabo-Islamic inscriptions exemplify this trend and likewise remove any ambiguity about the importance of Muhammad to the eschatological fate of the believers. They testify to a belief in the eschatological intercession of Muhammad for his followers that predates the written testimonies of later traditions in the Hadith corpus considerably. Like these early traditions, the inscriptions unambiguously cast Muhammad into the role of an eschatological intercession for his nation, his ummah, and expect believers to find solace in the future intercessory activities of their prophet and their ummah. Here's that. Forward. Okay. So I'm going to show you kind of six, well, there's more than six, but six main sites where we have a shafa'a attested in early Islamic inscriptions. They mostly all appear along this route here, following up to kind of the western side, the Hijaz, basically all the way up to the Levant. All of them except, so all of them that you see here except for 1A and B are non-official inscriptions. They're all graffiti. So we're going to start with the Dome of the Rock, and then we're going to move kind of downwards. All right. Okay, so Dome of the Rock, we all recognize this. This is the oldest photograph of the Dome of the Rock that I've ever found. I think that ever existed. It may be flipped the wrong way too. I can't remember whether or not I remember to flip it at all. But one of our first and most famous examples appears in these kind of beautiful kind of mosaic inscriptions that we all know that are on the inner and outer ambulatories of the Dome of the Rock. And on kind of the northeast section of the ambulatory, we have this kind of nice little kind of Arabic statement. It's very kind of basic and formulaic, should be very familiar, it's pretty easy to read. Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, la ilaha illallah, wahdahu, la sharika lahu, lahu al-mulk, wa lahu al-hamd, yuhyi wa yumit, wa huwa ala kulli shay qadir. This is typical Quranic idiom. But then we get to something that's not Quranic all of a sudden, where it says, Muhammadun Rasulullah sallallahu alayhi wa sallam, wa taqabbal shafa'atuhu yawm al-qiyamah fi ummatihi. All right, this is our key phrase that we're interested in. Muhammad is the messenger of God. May God incline towards him. May God bless him, however you want to translate that. And accept his shafa'ah on the day of judgment in his ummah. So this is our oldest dated example. This part, so it dates to the 690, 692, I think is the date. Oldest example, dated example and attestation for this belief that we have anywhere. It's on an official inscription on an extremely important monument at an extremely important location. And it has a number of important kind of paleographic features that I want to point out that point to its earliestness that we're going to also be looking for when we're looking at other inscriptions that follow later. So the first thing I want to note is the lack of a stacked meme. If you see the name Muhammad written like that, very flat across the line, that's usually an indicator of being very early. But even more reliable than that is the open medial ein is a really good example, all right? And the other thing we're going to be looking for is this retroflex yeah here. That's another good example of kind of early kind of Islamic paleography. So in essence, the nice thing about the phrase is that we have always these open eins here, and then we have these retroflex yes here. It makes it very easy to kind of use two of our best criteria for dating undated early epigraphy on paleographic grounds, right? Which, with all the provisos of, you know, what that entails, right? There's no certainty really without a date. Okay, so the key thing I want to make about the context of this inscription is that, like I said, it's on the inner part of the inscription on the northeast, right? And so that's right here. This is where the inscription is, and then we have one more inscription that mentions shafa'ah as well. And that is on the eastern door, facing the Mount of Olives. Right? This is the famous panel with the wooden and the copper put over it. Okay. This is a much longer inscription. I'm not going to read the whole thing, but one of the things that's interesting is, I mean, everybody knows that Al-Ma'mun came through and messed up these inscriptions and things like that. He did it both to the mosaic inscriptions, of course, and he also did it to the wooden panels as well. And you can see the effects of it right here really strongly. These are the last two lines of the inscription. You can see where it was cut, actually, invisibly. And you can also tell how these letterings they're in an old style, but they're very cramped, right? They don't fit the same kind of spacing as the top. So there's this thought to be more or less the dating to the exact same period as the mosaic inscriptions that actually do give us a date, even though these don't give us a date. Anyway, the idea of the Prophet Muhammad's shafa'ah appears in the last line on the 7th here. I don't know if you can see it. Yes. So here it is. وَتَقَبَّلْ شَفَاعَاتُهُ فِي أُمَّاتِهِ, so on and so forth, right? And so it's clearly attested, it's clearly part of something that the Umayyads themselves were promoting as part of their kind of monumental official ideology. It's a key kind of icon of what they're responding to. I kind of have, it's for me, whether or not it's important to Umayyad ideology or they're just harnessing some kind of pre-existing religiosity already, that's something I think is maybe a little bit debatable. We can talk about that a little bit later. But what I wanted to do is to go on, oh, by the way, this is where it's located on the eastern gate. What I want to do is talk about a little bit the location of both these inscriptions in facing towards the east and facing towards the Mount of Olives and why they might kind of be important for the Dome of the Rock in general, right? So I think that the eschatological role assigned to Muhammad on these inscriptions is probably integral to how we understand the Dome of the Rock itself, and many of the eschatological themes that we find in its inscriptions, and also the eschatological significance of the site itself to kind of Umayyad ideology and probably Muslim religiosity broader. And this is the importance of Jerusalem and the Sham largely is Ard al-Mahshar wal-Manshar, right? So the land, I guess, of the ingathering and the dispersal unto judgment. And the rock itself is the site of God's kind of throne on earth, the lower part of God's throne on earth. So where are you going to be judged before the throne of God? Here, this is where you're going to be. So in essence, its scriptures declare the importance not of the Dome of the Rock merely as an imperial prize, which it certainly is, and that it certainly is part of his ideology, but also its importance as the location of an imminent day of judgment, and all the nations of the earth will gather to face God's swift account. These are also words that we find in the inscriptions. And Muhammad will appear to intercede on behalf of his nation. We get a lot of interesting hadith that are really pretty early, at least they appear in some of our earliest collections, that kind of even tell the story or paint the scene of Muhammad's intercessory role, how it's going to go down. The earliest collection that I've found it in is the Musnad of Abdullah ibn Mubarak, incredibly early important figure. He probably wasn't well, I haven't done the important Eschatological Muh analysis, but I don't think he's the guy that invented it, but maybe he was, who knows? I haven't really done, I should make too many claims. But one of the most striking images that we get in that scene, what I wanted to do, this is the view from the Mount of Olives, by the way, so this is like the entrance when we all die and we're resurrected. This is the path we're going to take. So in any case, traditions from mid-2nd century, 8th century, portrayed Muhammad's intercessional activity as unique among the prophets. And indeed, the inscription of the Dome of the Rock only assigns an intercessory role to the Prophet Muhammad, even though another prophet is mentioned, Jesus, of course. On the Day of Judgment, according to these traditions, the Dam will basically approach all the prophets underneath the throne of God. And they'll approach Noah, they'll go to Moses, they'll go to Jesus, and they'll ask each of them to intercede on their behalf. And as the story goes, they all refuse, right? And at last, the damned, they throw themselves before the Prophet Muhammad, and only he will throw himself down beneath the throne of God to intercede on behalf of the damned and obtain his mercy, but only for his ummah in particular. So it's kind of this really kind of striking scene of all the damned amongst humanity. They go to all the prophets, they say, no, 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 thanks. And then the Prophet Muhammad, he's the only one of them that deigns to intercede or dares to intercede. And he throws himself beneath the throne of God and he intercedes on behalf of his ummah. Okay. So his intercessory act is notably on behalf of a collective. Muhammad intercedes for his nation only, for his ummah, and to the exclusion of other nations. And they're the only ones that really have hope of salvation through his intercession. And it seems to me that by the time we get to these traditions already, probably by the middle of the kind of 2nd, 8th century, we're at a considerable remove from the radical eschatological individualism that we see in the Quranic corpus. Okay. Later works, especially the Merits of Jerusalem genre, are complete with early traditions which identify the rock with the lower throne of God, etc. But the importance of kind of Jerusalem eschatologically is also, interestingly enough, attested in other epigraphy as well, not even just on the Temple Mount, Moshe Sharon, and also Friedmann have published this very interesting text from 776 that quotes Qaf, Surah Qaf, verse 41. And listen for the day that the caller calls out from a nearby place, so min Meccan qarib. And instead of having the word Meccan qarib, it replaces the word of Meccan qarib with Aliyah, so with Jerusalem. It's a pretty extraordinary inscription. So I think also some insight might be gathered if we look at a lot of the traditions that are attributed to a prominent scholar of the Umayyads and companion of Abd al-Malik, Ibn Shihab al-Zuhri, who dies in 742. Already we see in Zuhri's material, and we don't just find it among Zuhri and the Bedouins, we also find it among Basrans like Qatada and other kind of major figures like this, a very strong attempts to make exegetical connections or find exegetical warrant for belief in the prophethood of Muhammad. We find this in particular in the 17th surah, Banu Israel, in the 79th verse, where you have this kind of obscure statement that seems to be addressed to the prophet, where it says to him, and during the night wake and pray, and as an extra offering of your own, so that perhaps your Lord may resurrect you to a praiseworthy station. It's not very clear. مِنَ اللَّيْلِ فَتَحَجُّدْ بِهِ نَافِلَةً لَكَ عَسَّ أَنْ يَبْعَثَكَ رَبُّكَ مَقَامًا مَحْمُودًا. Right? What does that maqama mahmuda mean? So we already get in the tafsir of Abd al-Razak al-San'ani and others, kind of a whole host of scholars that say that this Meccan Mahmud is the intercessory station that is granted to Muhammad, the special kind of gift that's granted to Muhammad as like the noblest of prophets among his community. Abd al-Razak from Muhammad, from Zuhri, cites Ali Zayn al-Abidin as saying the following. The Prophet, God bless him and grant him peace, said, when it is the day of resurrection, God shall stretch out the earth like a tanned hide until a man shall have no place except where his 2 feet are planted. And the Prophet, God bless and grant him peace, said, I will be the first who is summoned while Gabriel stands on the right of the merciful, and by God I did not see him before. I have no idea what that means. He continued, I shall say, my Lord, this one told me that you sent him to me. And God will say, he spoke truly, and then I shall intercede. And this is the Prophet Muhammad speaking. My Lord, your servants serve you in the far reaches of the earth. This, he said, is the praiseworthy station. This is the maqam al-mahmud, this kind of instance of intercession. And we find it kind of generally in a bunch of different traditions. Okay, so let's look at the other inscriptions themselves, the graffiti. That's some other slides, Quranic quotations. I didn't get to them, forgive me. So a lot of these appear once we start going south of the Levant, alongside this kind of route through the Hisma region, which is just kind of west of Tabuk. And we kind of follow this route, this kind of Hajj route, this trading route, down through kind of the Hijaz, Medina, Mecca, and then even farther south beyond Mecca to the Asir region. We usually find a lot of these inscriptions along this way. Most of these inscriptions that have been found and are kind of a mixture between scriptures that have been professionally and academically documented by Saudi scholars like Sa'ad al-Rashid, and more recently Maysa al-Ghaban in her dissertation. She's the daughter of Ali al-Ghaban. I mean, some of these are just posted on Twitter or posted on blog sites by kind of amateurs that, I call them amateurs, but in like the real meaning of the term. It means like some like passion or love for something. I can't remember what the actual etymology is. But I don't mean in terms like they're doing a bad job or anything. I mean, there's things that we would want. We want coordinates and we want centimeters and we want like proper documentation. But a lot of these have not received their full documentation. Some of them have, some of them have not. But they post them on their blogs, they post them on Twitter, and I collect them and I'm waiting for them to be published so maybe one day I can cite them properly. But in any case, they're very interesting nonetheless. And the type of stuff that they find is, I think, continually kind of a source of surprise. So one of the first examples, right, is actually, this is from Maysa Ghaman's dissertation about the inscriptions of the Hisma region. So this one is documented well. And this is not dated, but it's written by someone that carries the Nisba Ansari. And but if we look at it, we can see it has very old paleographic features. So we'll see here, Allahumma salli ala al-nabi al-ummi. And so we have one of the yas does not go retroflex, but al-ummi does here. And then we have وَتَقَبَّلْ شَفَاعَتُهُ. You would expect shafa'atuhu, but there's a missing tooth. So is it تقبل شفاعة, or did he just skip over the letter? You decide for yourself. And then في retroflex يا, and then أمته وكتب عبد الرحمن ابن نعمان ابن عبد الله, and then this is ابن أبي حبيبة الأنصاري, right? ثم أخي بني عمرو بن عوف. Okay.
Recording
So,
in progress.
Not dated, so we don't know 100% where it's from, but it appears in paleographic terms as part of our kind of earliest stratum of, Arabo-Islamic inscriptions. Well, look, in the same region, this one has not been properly documented as far as I know, and this is found by a group called the Sahra team. Fariq al-Sahra. I really recommend their website. It's very cool. These guys get out in a Jeep and they just go out in the desert and see what they can find. But this one's dated, which is nice. It's dated after the Dome of the Rock. Let's read it together. So, Allahumma salli ala, let's read it from here. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. This is not very clear here. And then it's actually, it's easier to read online for some, on my computer, but anyway. Muhammad al-Nabi, we assume, is here. وَتَقَبَّلْ شَفَاعَاتُهُ فِي, and this is أُمَّتِهِ, right? وَرَحَمْنَا بِهِ فِي الْآخِرَةِ كَمَا رَحَمْتَنَا بِهِ فِي الدُّنْيَا, right? وَكَاتَبَ, what is it, Bakr ibn Abi Bakr al-Aslami, tamam sanata 80. So this would be 80 here. So that's year 80, we're around 700. So after the construction of the Dome of the Rock. Again, one of the problems that we're going to be recurring to is, are these inscriptions a reflection of a religion, or are they reflections of an underlying religiosity, right, that is reflected both in monumental and official inscriptions and unofficial inscriptions, or are they inscriptions that are influenced by a ideological program of the Umayyads? It's not 100% clear. Here's one that was discovered by Sa'ad al-Rashid. Don't really know 100% who he is. I think I said a little bit on who he might be in an updated version of this. Yeah, I did. Okay. That's good. We might know who he actually is. Let's read it from here. So, Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin al-Nabi, so retroflex. وَتَقَبَّلْ شَفَاعَتُهُ, again, the shafa'a is not spelled quite as we would expect. Fi Abu, it's like that, we expect Abi. Umama, and this is probably Ghulam. And then you see here, you see here that the what's going to be like the first name of probably the master of the Ghulam stops. I would guess it'd be Omar or Amr or something like this. And then we have Ibn Abi Hussein, Amin. What's that one? Rab, Arham, what is it? Allah man qala Amin. Okay? So, we don't really know who this is. It has old features, so we have this open ayn again, retroflex, yeah. I try to figure out who this individual might be, this Ibn Abi Hussein. Not 100% certain, of course, but this is found in Mecca, and it's found in an area called Sidad al-Hajjaj, and so they're part of these sudud, what's the word? Like the dams that you have, like in the eastern part of Mecca, and you have a lot of inscriptions that are found across kind of the remains of these dams. And if you have actually the edition of Faqihi, Akhbar Mecca, that was done by Abd al-Malik ibn Duhayy, she actually has pictures of all these locations in like the 5th volume of this book. It's really nice. In any case, they're called Sidad al-Hajjaj because al-Hajjaj ibn Yusuf al-Thaqafi built them supposedly after the killing of al-Zubair ibn Marwan. Ibn al-Zubair, not al-Zubair ibn Marwan. And so as it seems that it was written after the construction of these dams, perhaps. It's not 100% certain. We do have a late Umayyad dignitary by the name of Omar ibn Sa'id ibn Abi Hussein. He's from the Banu Nawfal, he's Qurashi. Whether or not this is that guy, I mean, anybody knows. It's kind of just guesswork at this point. All right. Here's one that has not yet been properly documented yet, but it's more. I think the first person that put it online just like maybe a year ago or last year, but they found it in the Asir region. It says a very interesting a variant of this. So he says, Allahumma salli ala Muhammad abdika wa rasulika wa taqabbal shafa'atuhu في أمته أمين ثم أمين وكتب زياد بن ذكوان يوم الأحد في جمادى من 500 وهو يسأل الله جنة نزول وعيوذ بالله من النار. Right. So here we have a date. All right. So this is 105/723. Again, this is post Abd al-Malik, but a pretty broad attestation, just as you kind of go down the region. And again, the eschatological themes that you see here, we also find elsewhere as well. There's this idea of asking for paradise as a place of residence and things like that. One of the more interesting ones, again, not published yet, appears as kind of a group of 3 inscriptions. This is found, I believe, west of Medina, between Medina and Yanbu. And it was posted on Twitter. I have no idea where its actual location is. But it has 3 inscriptions. And but it names 2 people. And both of them have a nisba, but it's a single, well, they have a nasab, I mean. They only name their fathers. And so one of the guys' names is Tamam, and the other guy's name is Al-Fadl. And the father's name is Al-Abbas, which is very enticing. And one of the reasons why it's enticing, because those are the names of 2 sons of Al-Abbas ibn Abdul Muttalib, right? So we're talking potentially very interesting people if this would be them. We have no way of identifying that or saying this for sure, but the script is very old. It'd be nice to know more. But here, we only have one of the 3 that mentions Shafa'a, and this is from Tamam. Allahumma salli ala Muhammadin an-Nabi wa taqabbal shafa'atuhu waj'al tamaman min rufaqa'ihi fi al-Jannah. Ameen. And you can see this is kind of the actual inscription. Notice how Muhammad is right across the line in flat, just like we see in the Dome of the Rock inscriptions, right? And then also when the Shafa'a here is kind of hard to see, and then we have the kind of open ayn here, right? And it doesn't have fi ummah, so we don't have a retroflex. But we have the clear retroflex for the Salli and then Ala and things like that, and also a Nabi as well. Okay. All right, so along with the Shafa'a inscriptions that we have here, these are all their locations. The last one we looked at was here, so I just basically went down and then I popped back up for Tamam. We also have inscriptions that mention something that's called the pool or the Hawd. And they appear, well, that's not a great color. I only have 3 of them, so we'll be done with them quickly. We'll do 9, 8, and 10. I think, which one? I think we're starting with 10, so I think I did the numbers wrong. Anyway. So the Hawd is an interesting idea. Yusuf N.S. has called the Hawd a very communal idea. So we get this idea of being saved as a community more than being saved as an individual, right? But the Hawd idea is very closely related to the idea of Shafa'at in general, and because the idea of the Hawd is where the Prophet will rejoin his followers at the Day of Judgment. And it seems really to be a sub-theme of this later kind of eschatological development. And it plays a very prominent role in Hadith as well. I recommend you Totoli's article. But the typical Hadith that are associated with this is usually the Prophet Muhammad starts by saying, "Inni faratukum ala al-hawd," that I'm going to be the first among you that will appear at the basin. And thereafter he proceeds to deliver usually some sort of pious warning or an injunction to good deeds, to remember that you're going to have to face the Prophet and you're going to want to be admitted to the Hawd before kind of you go on to your eventual eschatological fate. So prayers to be led to this eschatological pool seem to be dated from this exact same period. So we get the emergence of these eschatological ideas from the same kind of late Marwana period. This is a very well-known inscription. It's very old. It was discovered by Aloy Musul, I think all the way back in the 19th century. And it hasn't really been read very well until Werner Diem and Marco Scholler kind of republished it in The Living and the Dead. But you get a lot of the basic eschatological themes that you find in the other inscriptions. Allahumma aghfir lil Abdul Aziz ibn al-Harith ibn al-Hakam. There is an Umayyad official that has this name. Whether or not this is that guy, we have no idea. ما تقدم من ذنبه وما تأخر وعرف بينه وبين ذريته في مستقير من رحمتك وأورده إلى الحوض محمدا. And then the rest is kind of lost, right? So may God forgive Abdul Aziz ibn al-Harith ibn al-Hakam what preceded and what came late of his sins, and make him recognize or rejoin him with his progeny and an abode of your mercy, and guide him to the pool of Muhammad. Again, it's undated, it's very old. One of the things that's a bit interesting about this one in particular is the way that Mosul transcribes this. He transcribes it with a closed ayn for all the medial ayns. So for al-Aziz, for Li'abd, and things like that. And so it seemed that it would be outside our time period, even though this is potentially an Umayyad figure. Most people have dated it to around 100 Hijri, following Mosul's identification of this figure. I don't think there's a really strong basis for this. There's other indications that it is early, like the small, tiny ra and things like this. But what's unclear, if you look at the picture, this is the best picture I've found. I don't know if it's still visible or anything like that, is you can't really see the ayns very well. And I don't know if Mosul, when he was transcribing or tracing the inscription, kind of just assumed there would be a top to the ayn and put it there himself, or whether or not it actually belongs. So it's a little bit uncertain to me. Two of the most interesting inscriptions, I think, to mention the Hawd of Muhammad, however, were discovered by Sa'ad al-Rashid in the Asir region. And these are the two. They're part of this kind of the old mosque, part of the foundation stones. This is the Asir. Look at this one in particular. This is a very interesting inscription because not only does it contain mention of the Hawd, but also it has a number of Quranic surahs in it. So it begins, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim, Qul huwa Allahu ahad, Allahu samad, lam yalid, wa lam yulid, wa lam yakun Allahu kufuwan ahad. And then this is Ikhlas, of course. And then we have Kawthar following quickly thereafter. And أعطيناك الكوثر فصلي لربك وانحر إن شأنك هو الأبتر. Right? And then we have these two Quranic surahs, and then we have the post-Quranic prayer. Right? اللهم صل على محمد النبي الأمي وتقبل شفاعته في أمته وردنا حوضه Amin وكتب عثمان ibn Qais. Again, we don't really know who this Uthman ibn Qais is. It's not dated. We have figures that do seem to belong in the late Umayyad period that are identified by the name Uthman ibn Qais. Is it him? I'm not sure. He's associated with Khalid al-Qasri, who many of you may know as an Umayyad governor, and he's associated with him during Khalid al-Qasri's tenure in kind of the region of Mecca. This is not Mecca, of course, but it's closer than when Khalid al-Qasri was out in Iraq, of course. Fascinating inscription, seems to be by paleographic criteria to be late Umayyad, but it could be a little bit later than that. Here's the other one. In the name of God, the merciful and compassionate. So, Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. In Allah wa malakat. I always have a hard time with this. Malakatuhu. Yusalluna ala nabi. Ya ayyuha alladhina amanu. Sallu alayhi wa sallamu tasliman. Salawat Allah wa malakatuhu ala Muhammad al-Nabi al-Ummi al-Hadi. Which is interesting. Al-Mibrak is what it has, but Mubarak is what you expect, of course. Allahumma aridna hawdahu ghayra khazi. ولا ناظمين ولا ضالين ولا مضللين آمين ثم آمين وكتب عثمان بن قيس ولله الحمد وهو أهل. So same guy, similar theme appears again. Right. And the last one is from Jordan. This one has been properly documented and properly studied. It's quite long. I don't want to go over the entire thing, but as you can see, we have perhaps a mention of intercession. We don't know because we have this big gap here. Whether or not it's actually late Umayyad or not, I have my doubts, particularly because of the way that Muhammad is written with the stacked meme. That tends to be later. but it does have open eins at the end, and this retroflex ya is also present, so it has sort of a mixture of both stages, it seems. So we can guess and say it might be late Marwanid, again, not 100% certain. In any case, if we go through the whole thing, it's a lot of eschatological themes. And then we also have the mention of the pool, perhaps, again, like I said, with the Shafa'ah. Not only do we have mention of the pool, but we also have something else, a kas, or the chalice, right? So help us to join us to his thulla, his group or his band, and awradna hawduhu, and give us and guide us to his hawd, wasqina ka'suhu, and give us a drink of his chalice, وَبَلِغْهُ مِنَّا تَحْيَةً وَتَسْلِيمًا, and give him our greetings and salutations and things like that. Okay? All right. I'm okay on time? Am I going too far? Okay. All right. So, conclusions. The emergence of these two themes so early on in the Rabo-Islamic epigraphic record carries important consequences for how one ought to understand the reception of the Quran and the idiom of its religiosity on the one hand, and how early Muslim religiosity continued to expand the themes of the Quranic corpus on the other. Historians are mostly accustomed to relying on sources like hadith, the hadith corpus, and less often Arabic poetry to explore these developments. Arabic poetry is actually very interesting. We didn't get to talk about it, but the idea of shifa'ah appears in a lot of early kind of Arabic poets as well that are from the early Umayyad period. Anyway, okay, the eschatological themes presented above, or not above, but here, are not merely extra Quranic interpolations that we find interwoven to otherwise familiar Quranic idiom of early Arabo-Islamic inscriptions. These themes are also post-Quranic, insofar as they represent developments in Muslim religiosity that post-date the closure of the Quran as a corpus and presume its existence. Were they written simultaneously with, rather than after the closure of the Quranic corpus, one would not expect to see such a diachronic development, nor would one expect to see such an identifiable hard and fast thematic distinction between the two corpora. Hence, these inscriptions simultaneously draw from and build on earlier religiosity of the Quran and anticipate themes later tested in the Hadith corpus by the middle of the 8th century. And that suggests that they represent a middle point between the two. Here I focused on but two examples, but I suspect further investigations might find additional ones. And there are additional ones, especially there's a lot of prayers that are associated with Hajj and other things, like just basically dua that we find recorded in like the Muwatta that will also appear in a lot of these early inscriptions as well. Some of them are around Mecca, actually, that are associated with the Hajj. The inscriptions do not yet provide what one would call a hadith of the rocks, God forbid. However, they do indeed foreshadow many aspects of Muslim religiosity, which eventually enter the historical record of Muslim religiosity found in the Hadith corpus. All right, thank you.
Thank you very much, Sean, for this. I find it extremely interesting and important. You put your emphasis in the talk on the themes, but what I find striking in your talk is that we have here evidence of Islam and Muslims in Arabia. The first inscription you talked about, the Dome of the Rock, is of course very well known, but it is in Jerusalem. And we have for decades already all this talk about Islam emerging outside of Arabia and the Quran being received only much later, and so on and so forth. And these inscriptions, I think, point to Islam distinctly in Arabia in the 1st century. And this is extremely important to my mind. And what I wanted to ask you is, are there other inscriptions of the same period that are still just religious but not distinctive Islamic, like Irfir li Abdika and so on and so forth? You know, the kind of inscriptions that are supposed not to point to Muslims, but just to other religious people, and that Islam only permeated Arabia much later. Are there still in this period such general religious inscriptions?
They're very common. I mean, I would say they're more common to find inscriptions that are very short, that say something like "Aghfir li fulan wali waladay" or something like this, or "Usikum bi birrillah," or these are the typical formulas that you find. I mean, part of the ways that I'm putting my thumb on the scale here is I'm choosing the longer inscriptions, right, that have more material. But if you look at them in kind of the context of all the inscriptions, these kind of stand out as, pretty significant outliers of the general trend. I mean, part of it I think has to do with the fact that it takes a really long time to write something like this out, all right? And most people didn't take the time to do that type of stuff. And so when they do, it's exceptional. We don't necessarily know why they did always. But the longer ones do stand out. But we do have more examples. I mean, one thing I would recommend if you're looking for just a general kind of survey of the type of Islamic inscriptions that you get in the Hijaz and stuff, I would just pick up something by like Nasr al-Harathi or Sa'ad al-Rashid. These things can sometimes be difficult to get because a lot of these books don't leave Saudi. But they're really excellent. They're very well done, very well documented, very well discussed. And you'll find like the Quranic graffiti that mention the Quran, that cite the Quran and things like that in Mecca and throughout Medina. And some of them are very recognizable figures. Yanbu has a number of very interesting inscriptions that actually mention the great-grandsons of Ali in the territory that they very famously kind of occupy. It's one of the ones that I'm working on right now. But like there's a lot there, and I feel like we're kind of really just at the beginning of appreciating how large this corpus is and how important it is.
Yeah, thank you. It's really fascinating. Yohanan, can you please take over? Yohanan?
Yes, Ethan, please.
No, thank you very much. I'd just like to use this opportunity to mention our late colleague Uri Rubin. One of his arguably last contributions was in a paper, in a volume in honor of Yohanan Friedmann, a paper in Hebrew called Muhammad versus Jesus, in which he discusses in detail the Dome of the Rock, the mosaic inscription, and the copper plates, and also emphasizes the importance of Shafa'ah there as being extra Quranic. So just to mention that.
That's wonderful. Yeah, thank you for being. Yeah, he's definitely missed. One thing that is interesting on that note too is that in the third Islamic century, I think, as we first get them, we start to get Christian Arabic, and I have it in like the paper, the link. I haven't decided how to yet fit it into the paper, but we have Christian Arabic inscriptions in the Sinai, where we have prayers for Shafa'ah, but instead of Shafa'ah of Muhammad, of course, it's the Virgin Mary, which is a really I mean, of course, the idea of intercession is already present all over the place in late antique Christianity before the rise of Islam. But it is interesting that when Christians begin to adopt Arabic and it becomes a medium for their own religious expression, they kind of reach for, they reach into basically the drawer of kind of Arabo-Islamic vocabulary, and they use words like Shafa'ah and things like that. And the inscriptions look very similar to a lot of these early Muslim ones.
Very interesting and exciting talk, and I was especially excited because tomorrow I'm going to talk about Asa an yab'athaka rabbuka maqaman mahmuda. So we will connect. And actually the inscriptions show that the concept of Shafa'ah is the early concept and not the later concept that the Hanabila tried to put into the discourse, which is the concept of al-julus. And this is what I'm going to talk tomorrow, so be with us. And we didn't have anything to do with it before. I have a question about the spelling or the form of the verbs that are shown in the inscriptions, because Salli Muhammad was written sometimes with a ya and sometimes without. So is it common? Is it?
Yeah, it's very common to find. So it's a really interesting. So there's many ways in which it's written. It's very frequent to find the ya not there. It's very frequent to find the ya there. Another thing that I think would be surprising when you look at the inscriptions too is a lot of times the tasliya is said after regular people. So it's not just said after the prophet's name. We get this somewhat with some of our early Abbasid stuff. I think we have examples of people doing a tasliya for the caliphs and stuff. And I know there's a letter of Umar ibn Abdul Aziz where he actually rebukes people for doing tasliya for people other than the prophet. But the inscriptions in general, when they do the tasliya, it's pretty variable. It seems like it doesn't have consistency. But the question was
about the proper way to write
the... properly, I don't think it's necessarily standardized totally. And a lot of these inscriptions do contain what we would consider to be, I avoid this language, but mistakes. Like it seems like you have missing letters, things that seem garbled. And you find that even in very fine, there's one absolutely beautiful inscription of a Meccan surah that's right outside Mecca, and the hand is so fine and so artful, but he totally garbles 5 words, and a lot of they're very different. And how can you be that careful and you mess things up? It's just a common thing. I mean, I don't know how many times I've lectured and went to go write something on the board and what is the spelling of this? And you just forget how to write it standardly. So I think it's just a natural byproduct of writing, basically.
Thank you.
Thanks. No, excellent lecture. That was very stimulating. I think I've just got 2 or 3 remarks. I hope they add up to a question. If not, I'd really just like to get your response. So, I mean, got 2 microphones. Thanks. And stand on one leg. And so, as you say, the Quran is ambivalent on intercession. So when the Quran is sort of countering the pagans, then intercession is ruled out, but then there's permitted intercession. I think that's probably the angels. I think there's some evidence that the angels perform intercession, but of course the angels in the Quran are just sort of machines of praise, so they're not autonomous agents. So in a way, they simply explicate whatever eschatological verdict God is going to pronounce. So if they intercede, then that just means that basically the divine judge has given you the thumbs up. They're not able to sway God's verdict in any way. I think that kind of makes sense of this sort of with God's permission caveat. It's interesting that the Quran didn't reject that outright. So the Quran is clearly often very happy to sort of just contradict things and rule them out. But in the case of sort of angelic intercession, it seems to have been important enough for the Quran to sort of keep that in the picture. It seems to me that a lot of the inscriptions that you've presented actually kind of situate themselves against that general background insofar as the prayer is still addressed to God. So God is implored to accept the intercession of Muhammad, that the prayer isn't directed at Muhammad. So in that sense, the prophetic intercession it's still not an independent, autonomous act that could sway God's verdict. I wonder whether you'd agree with that. And then final remark. So there are a few passages in the Medinan surahs where Muhammad is depicted as performing istighfar on behalf of the believers. I mean, that happens in this world rather than the next, but I wonder whether that could be seen as a sort of something that they then elaborated upon.
Definitely the istighfar thing is a majorly important theme, especially in terms of using proof text to argue for all of this as having Quranic sanction in some way. But I think there is this interesting distinction, which you basically mentioned, is it's one thing to imagine that it's a good and pious thing to be like, oh Lord, be merciful upon someone. Like if someone passes, you say rahimahullah, it doesn't mean that you have some sort of belief that you are able to sway God's sovereignty, right? Ultimately He is Malik al-Muluk, sorry, Malik al-Mulk, he's also that too. But in any case, he has his sovereignty at the end, but you're doing a pious act. And I think the eschatological edge of it is kind of what's interesting, right? And the hadith are, again, they're a lot more explicit. Like one of them that I didn't mention, I think it's in the paper, where the Prophet says that every Nabi is given like a dua, like a special dua. And the idea is he's given a special prayer that will work. It's sort of like the one wish. You know, you don't get 3 wishes, but he gets 1 wish, and it's a special efficacious prayer. And why he's unique among the prophets is he chose to keep it in reserve in his pocket until the day of resurrection, where he can pull it out and be like, this is the ticket that you gave me, God. I'm turning it in the raffle ticket, and you have to honor it, right? And so it's a nice kind of thought. And I think one of the reasons why it is a popular idea is because it's a way to redound to the unique status of the Prophet among the Prophet Muhammad among the other prophets, right? That he has even some special role at the end of time. Yeah.
Yes, yes, please.
Thank you, Sean. Indeed, an excellent talk. I enjoyed it very much. Just a question about the names and identification of person.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have any statistical data about frequency of names and the chronology of this frequency according to inscriptions and also narrative sources?
Yeah.
And perhaps I think this inscription with the year 105 is really excellent, because one may say that the year 80 is, the 100th digit is missing, but 105 is simply excellent. I mean, 100 would be the best, but 105 is good enough. Thank you.
Yeah. I mean, so I don't have the statistics of that. I'm not very good at doing the counting. That's why I stick to the themes. Ilka Lindstedt has a really nice article in a volume that we published a chapter together and called The Umayyad World, where he gets a nice kind of overview of all the early epigraphy that we think dates to the Umayyad period. Also, Hoyland has a really great article that he published in the journal here as well, that he kind of gives this overview. But in terms of the statistical information of names and stuff like that, it's hard to say. I mean, what we constantly get are a lot of hits that make you feel like excited. You know, like there was one that was recently discovered that was like Ja'far ibn Muhammad. So everybody's like, oh, it's Ja'far as-Sadiq, right? And so there's no way of knowing, right? This is we do have some random, you know, examples too, where someone writes Umar ibn Khattab and things like this, and you know, some of them seem to be almost certain that they're from the era of the person, like the famous Muawiyah inscription near Ta'if and things like that. But I mean, for the most part, I think that, yeah. So there's this. I have like this little thing that I wrote where it's not my idea, but I think it applies. And whenever you do epigraphy, material evidence, you should put the analysis of the material as the material that it is first, and should not follow something called the positivist fallacy. You know, like, so like you dig something up, like, oh, this is the proof that this is the story that I found in this book, right? You analyze the inscriptions as inscriptions first, and then, you know, maybe something else will come along that will tell you this is actually this or that and the other. But yeah, to me, one thing that is more interesting, I think that can be done, is we have a lot of times groups of inscriptions that are in the same area, and they all share the same nasab, and they seem to be families. And a lot of these families, and the more names that you have, and then the more overlap that you start to get with these ansab works, it's kind of really hard to say that this is not these individuals. You know, so there's a group of inscriptions that the Sahara team came across that I can't remember. I think it has one that's Walid ibn Uqba. So this is a companion of the Prophet. At least his name, same guy. And then all the other names of his sons and stuff. And the names just so happen to match what you find in like Nasab Quraysh type works. What do I make of that? It's a pretty damn good argument, I think. But, you know, how much certainty do you need to accept it? It kind of depends from scholar to scholar. So.
Yes.